Elliot Wells, a man of deep faith, had always been a pillar of the local community. As the beloved pastor of a small church nestled in the hills of Virginia, he was known for his warmth, kindness, and his unwavering belief in helping others. His congregation admired him for his humility, and many people sought his guidance when faced with life's toughest trials. To them, Elliot's life seemed perfect, but beneath the surface, a secret gnawed at his soul, a secret he carried alone for many years. The truth was, Elliot had never truly felt that his path in life was his own. Although he had been ordained as a pastor and had served the church for over a decade, he had always felt like he was living someone else's life, trapped in a calling that didn't quite fit him. He had always thought he was meant for something more, something different. The priesthood, although fulfilling for many, had never filled the emptiness he felt inside. Years ago, Elliot had been a completely different man. Before he became Pastor Elliot Wells, he had been known as Julian Hartman, a skilled and highly respected surgeon. Julian had been a rising star in the medical world, admired for his precision in the operating room and for saving countless lives. He had been well-liked and respected, and with his charming demeanor, women often fawned over him. But Julian's life was about to change forever. One fateful night, everything that he had worked for came crashing down in a way he never anticipated. Julian was called to an emergency operation late one night. A young child had been critically injured in a car accident, and it was up to Julian to save him. When he arrived at the hospital, his heart sank. His best friend, Greg, was already there, holding his son in his arms. The boy was unconscious, and the situation was dire. Greg looked at Julian with desperate eyes, pleading with him to save his son. "I know this is a big ask, Julian," Greg said, tears streaming down his face. "But you're the only one who can save him. Please, I trust you. Please save him." Julian, though a brilliant surgeon, had never performed surgery on a child. His heart raced, and for the first time in his career, he hesitated. "I've never done surgery on a child before, Greg," Julian said, his voice shaky. "I'm not sure if I can do this." Greg's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't say no, Julian. You're the only one I trust with his life. Please, don't let my son die." The desperation in Greg's voice hit Julian like a ton of bricks. He couldn't refuse. With a heavy heart, Julian agreed to perform the surgery. But despite his skill and training, things went horribly wrong. The surgery was more complicated than anticipated, and Julian lost the boy on the operating table. The grief and guilt that followed were overwhelming. Julian found himself paralyzed by the thought that he had failed not only Greg, but the child who would never have a chance to live a full life. After the funeral, Julian was a broken man. His heart ached every time he thought of Greg's tearful face and the child's lost potential. He couldn't shake the guilt, but his life was about to take an even darker turn. Greg, in his grief and anger, came to Julian's home. "You failed my son, Julian," he shouted, his voice full of rage. "You couldn't save him, and now he's gone. You're the reason my boy is dead." In a fit of anger, Greg pulled out a gun and shot himself in front of Julian. The last thing Julian saw was his friend's lifeless body, and the blood spilled onto the floor in front of him. The weight of Greg's death haunted Julian for the rest of his life. He couldn't live with the knowledge that he had failed to save the boy and that his best friend had taken his life because of it. The guilt was unbearable. Unable to live with the aftermath, Julian left everything behind. He left his medical career, his life as Julian Hartman, and the city he once loved. He retreated to a small, secluded town, hoping to escape the ghosts of his past. Julian became Pastor Elliot Wells. Though he tried to bury his past in the service of others, it still haunted him. Every sermon he delivered, every comforting word he spoke to his congregation, was a reminder that he was living a life he never chose. He had run from his past, but the past had a way of catching up. Elliot sat quietly in his small, modest office at the back of the church, looking out the window at the small community he had served for the last few years. It was a quiet life, a life he had grown accustomed to, though it often felt like he was simply going through the motions. His thoughts frequently wandered back to the past, to the days when he was Julian Hartman, a man who had everything: status, admiration, and the promise of a future that could have been full of purpose. But those days were gone now. The man he used to be was buried under the mantle of the priesthood, and no matter how much he tried to convince himself that he had found redemption, the guilt still lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the life he now led wasn't truly his. And every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the face of a man who was pretending. That morning, as usual, he had risen early and begun preparing for the day's service. He greeted his congregation with the same warm smile he always wore, delivering his sermon with sincerity. But a part of him was somewhere else, distant and detached. He had been a part of this small community for years now, but deep down, he knew he was not fully integrated. He was an outsider, hiding in plain sight. His thoughts constantly drifted back to the one thing that he could never truly escape: his past. Later that day, Elliot received a call from the local funeral director. A young woman named Sarah Martin had passed away unexpectedly, and her family had requested that Elliot preside over her funeral. As was customary, the funeral director gave him the details of the service and asked if he could perform the ceremony. Elliot's stomach turned as he heard the details. Something about this funeral felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The name, Sarah Martin, was unfamiliar to him, but there was an odd sense of familiarity to the situation. He brushed it aside as nerves, thinking it was nothing more than the weight of his responsibility as a priest. The funeral took place the following morning, and as Elliot entered the small chapel, he couldn't help but notice the somber faces of the family gathered in the front row. The grief was palpable, and as he walked toward the altar, he felt a familiar twinge of discomfort. This was part of his job. After all, he had presided over countless funerals before, but something was different today. The family, dressed in dark clothing, seemed nervous, as if they were waiting for something. The young woman, Sarah, lay in an open casket at the front of the chapel, her face peaceful but cold. She looked far too young to be gone, and Elliot couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice. What had happened to her? He hadn't been told much beyond her name and the fact that she had passed unexpectedly. Elliot began the ceremony, trying to maintain his usual composure. As he began to speak the words of comfort, his eyes kept drifting back to Sarah's body. Her stillness was haunting, but what caught his attention wasn't just her appearance. There was something about her body, something that didn't sit right with him. As the service proceeded, Elliot couldn't help but notice a strange detail. As the family opened the casket so that the mourners could say their goodbyes, he saw something he could not ignore. Sarah's body looked unnaturally preserved. Her skin appeared untouched, not pale like most bodies would be, but instead with a subtle warmth. The marks on her neck that would be expected from an autopsy weren't there, and the pallor of death didn't seem to have settled in the same way it did with other bodies he had seen. His heart skipped a beat. What was going on here? Why did the body look as though it had been kept? Elliot tried to push the thought aside, but it nagged at him. He couldn't help but look closer. He had been a surgeon once, and his medical mind kicked into gear. As the mourners approached to pay their respects, Elliot quietly stepped closer to the casket, leaning in to inspect Sarah's body. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out to touch her hand. Suddenly, it hit him like a bolt of lightning, the strange sensation of déjà vu. He had seen this before, hadn't he? He had seen this body, or someone very similar to it. Many years ago. He stepped back, his mind racing. The room seemed to close in on him, the muffled sobs of the mourners fading into the background as his thoughts consumed him. His heart was pounding in his chest. He needed to leave, but he couldn't. It was then that he saw him, a man standing in the back of the room, his face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He looked strangely familiar, but Elliot couldn't place him. The man's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was a connection. The man's face tightened as he quickly turned away and headed toward the door. Elliot's stomach churned. There was no mistaking it. The man had recognized him too. It wasn't just his face that Elliot recognized. It was the man's presence, his aura. He had seen him before, long ago, when he was Julian Hartman. This man, a former colleague from his medical days, had been present during the tragic death of his best friend's son. Elliot's mind reeled as he tried to process the connection. The memories were flooding back, and his hands were shaking as he made his way to the back of the chapel. "Father, is everything all right?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was the funeral director. Looking concerned, Elliot didn't answer right away. He looked back toward the casket, then at the door where the man had disappeared. His pulse raced, and he could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him. Something wasn't right. He had to find out what happened to Sarah. Without a word, he rushed out of the chapel and into the street, following the man. His heart was racing, and the memories he had buried for so long were beginning to surface. Elliot had no choice but to face them head-on. He couldn't avoid the truth any longer. Elliot's footsteps echoed through the empty streets as he hurried after the man, his mind racing with thoughts he had pushed aside for years. The more he thought about it, the more everything started to make sense. Yet it was also more impossible than he could have imagined. The old memories, the faces, the guilt, everything came crashing back in an overwhelming flood. He had to confront what had been buried for so long. As the man turned a corner and disappeared from view, Elliot quickened his pace, pushing his body beyond its usual limits. He didn't care anymore about the funeral, about the grieving family, or the sermon he had yet to deliver. All that mattered now was the truth. He had to understand what had happened. Had he truly been responsible for the tragedy so many years ago? He reached the alleyway where the man had vanished, and there, standing in the dim light, was the same man, the one he had recognized. His back was turned, but there was no mistaking the distinct features, the posture that had once been so familiar. The man's name flashed in Elliot's mind, Dr. Marcus Lowell. "Dr. Lowell," Elliot called, his voice hoarse with urgency. The man froze for a second before slowly turning around. His face, lined with age but still carrying the weight of the past, was hard to read. His eyes, dark and intense, met Elliot's gaze with something between resignation and an old, painful recognition. "It's you," Elliot whispered, his breath catching in his throat. Dr. Lowell looked at him without speaking for a long moment. And then, finally, he sighed. "I thought you had forgotten. I hoped you had." "Forgotten?" Elliot asked, his voice shaking. "How could I forget? You were there. You know what happened." Marcus nodded grimly, stepping forward. "It wasn't supposed to end like this, Elliot. None of this was supposed to happen." The old memories hit Elliot like a wave. He remembered the hospital, the desperation in the air as his best friend's son, Peter, lay in a critical condition. He remembered that fateful night when they had been called in to try and save him. The boy was in need of immediate surgery, and Elliot, despite his best efforts, had failed. But what hurt the most was what had followed. "I didn't want to hurt him," Elliot said, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to be the one to fail him. I couldn't save him." "No, you didn't fail him," Marcus replied softly, "but you didn't get to him in time. And when you failed, I couldn't save him either. I tried. I tried so hard, but it wasn't enough," Elliot said, the guilt coming to the surface. "And then I saw you. The way you looked at me after it happened. You said I had killed him, that it was my fault. And," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm but filled with sorrow, "you misunderstood me. Elliot, it wasn't you. It wasn't your fault. I couldn't save him either. But we were both responsible. That night, we failed, and Peter died. But after that, I couldn't forgive myself. I had to find someone to blame, and you were the only one there." Elliot stood still, his heart hammering in his chest. The weight of the truth, the words he had never wanted to hear, settled over him like a dark cloud. So all of this, everything that happened afterward, it was my fault? "No, it wasn't," Marcus said. "You couldn't have done anything differently, but you were consumed by guilt, just like I was. You sought redemption in this life, in the priesthood, hoping to make up for what we couldn't do. But none of that has healed what we lost." "I wanted to heal," Elliot whispered. "I thought if I became a priest, I could find peace. I thought I could forget about the past. But then, when I saw her, Sarah, lying there in that casket, looking as though she was still alive, I knew something wasn't right." Marcus sighed deeply. It wasn't just her, was it? You thought you recognized her, didn't you? I could see it in your eyes. You saw the woman who had been lost to the world years ago. Elliot nodded slowly, still processing the conversation. I saw her face, and when I realized she wasn't dead, when I felt her pulse, it hit me. She wasn't meant to be gone. You were right, Marcus said, looking down at the ground. Sarah isn't just a victim. She's connected to something much darker. Her father, the man you saw at the funeral, he was the one who made sure she didn't die. Elliot stared at Marcus, his mind racing. Her father? But why would he? Sarah wasn't supposed to die that night, Marcus continued, his voice lowering. Her father, he made sure she was kept alive, hidden away. But he wasn't alone. The people involved, those who wanted her gone, didn't expect you, of all people, to find her. Elliot's heart began to race as the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together. So, her father was involved in something much bigger, something far more sinister. But why was she brought to me? To my church? That's the question, Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. And that's the part you need to understand. You've been chosen to witness what's about to happen. Elliot stepped back, his hands shaking. Chosen? For what? For redemption, Marcus replied, his voice almost a whisper. You may not know it yet, but the only way for you to find true peace is to stop running from your past and face it head on. Everything you've been hiding from, the guilt, the shame, it's all connected to the choices you made years ago. Elliot stood in stunned silence, trying to understand the weight of Marcus's words. There was no escaping this truth. It had followed him all these years, quietly waiting for the moment when he would be forced to confront it. So, what happens now? Elliot asked, his voice barely audible. Now, you go back to the church, Marcus said, and you save Sarah. You find the answers to all of this, and you make sure that the mistakes of the past don't define you. You can't run from this any longer. You have to face it, Elliot. With those words, Marcus turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Elliot standing there, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He knew what he had to do now. The past was no longer something he could hide from. It was time to confront it, no matter the cost. Elliot took a deep breath and turned back toward the church. The weight of the truth hung heavy on his chest, but there was no turning back. He would face what had happened, and perhaps, in doing so, find a path to redemption.